thank you all for being here, and those who've been here since 12 and hold out throughout the entire avalanche of feelings and thoughts and knowledge. Well done, thank you so much. So, as Momak said in the beginning, the point of MME, Migration Memory Encounters, is to highlight artwork, art, and I think we have seen the need for it in all the previous talks. So for this part of the conversation, we have invited 3 artists. So we have Michael Rakowitz, whose work is being exhibited at the moment here in the Konsthall. And if you have not seen it, you need to come back and really experience it. We have Sandi Hilal and we have Joanna Lombard. So I'm not going to introduce them, they can do that themselves. And then each of the artists here is going to have around 5 to 7 minutes to introduce themselves and some of their artwork. And after that we can chat. So, Michael.
Oh, I'm first.
Yes, it's your image.
Alright, so
You can take.
I can take this.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to the organizers. And I was happy to catch the last bit of the last session and to hear this really rewarding conversation emerge from it about decolonization and its possibilities in terms of intersecting with so much of what was being discussed. The projects that I have in the exhibition, I am not able to talk about all of them in 5 to 7 minutes, which is what we've been allotted here, and I hope that we have the time to have a discussion where more things can be brought out. But one of the thoughts that I had about what I could present in this very small time frame is just a kind of example of what I hope I'm doing with these works, which is to not only reappear these objects and these kinds of histories about Iraq, which have been made invisible or silenced, but to also make sure that those reappearances are attached to a conversation about the lives that have disappeared or been interrupted as a result of this kind of continued colonialism vis-a-vis war and material extraction, whether it's oil or antiquities. And so one of the ways in which this first really became apparent to me when I started this project, The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, is a work that began for me in 2006, even though it's responding to the looting of the National Museum of Iraq in 2003. It goes back even further, where it's also responding to the theft of the cultural patrimony by Western excavators in the middle of the 1800s, which continues today and continues to drive an antiquities market that is only kind of increasing in its robust trade. And when the National Museum of Iraq was looted, one of the stories that started to emerge was the way in which the curator, or the director of the museum, Dr. Dani Georgiou-Khana, had put himself into a kind of very dangerous position of trying to mitigate the damage and to mitigate the loss, to the point where he was sleeping overnight in the museum when the looting was occurring and doing his best to kind of protect the premises. Dr. Dani George's story, though, is something that also speaks to the kind of humanity and the kind of richness of Iraqi modern life that is always kind of lost under the way in which the portrait of that looting is shown as something that is a disaster that happens in the wake of war, as opposed to a kind of a real challenge to the dignity of the people of Iraq. And one of the things that happened with my research about this was that in as much as I was concerned with reappearing the artifacts that had just gone missing in the wake of the the Iraq War. It was also apparent to me that I could never disconnect the story of the artifact from the story of the people that perish alongside the artifact or disappear alongside the artifact. One of the things that we know from the museum is that the most common artifact that was taken and sold on the black market are these votive statues. And you've seen these Mesopotamian statues that have their hands clasped and are looking back at the viewer. And in ancient Babylon, for instance, those statues were actually made for worshippers who would go to the Akitu, or the temple, and they would pray. And you would bring that statue with you, and after you finished praying, you put that statue down in front of the shrine to your God, and it continued to pray for you. It was the same thing as lighting a candle in church, any other kind of votive experience. And so when the outrage about lost artifacts did not translate globally into an outrage about lost lives, I began this project as a kind of angry project, where those votives could once again be placeholders for the Iraqi lives that disappeared. And one of the stories of an Iraqi life that was interrupted was that of Dr. Dani Dorjukana, who in 2006 receives a threat from insurgents threatening him and his family. So within 3 hours, he had actually resigned his position as the director of the museum and became a refugee. He headed to Syria. And then months later, he ended up in New York, where he was going to teach. And Dr. Dani George's story is incredible. He was an Assyrian Christian, and in order to hold the position that he had in Iraq, he had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party. And so, not believing in the Ba'ath Party principles, what he did was something no museum director would ever do. He decided to participate directly on excavations so that he had a solid excuse to send to Saddam Hussein and the government to say, I'm sorry I can't be at the meeting, we found something incredible in Iskandariya. It was a circumvention of authority. And he was also a drummer in a band called 99%, which was Baghdad's best Deep Purple and Pink Floyd cover band. And this is where I really fell in love with the man, because it shows that also, as a cultural worker, he's not able to make enough income through the state in order to support his family, and he loves rock and roll. So, when I first showed this piece, it was accompanied by a series of drawings, and one of those drawings was of Dr. George playing the drums. And he came to New York at the same time that this exhibition happened. And the thing that he was most interested in the exhibition was, how did I get a photograph of him playing the drums? There's no YouTube videos of 99%, there's no MP3s. And so I told him, I went online and I found a picture of him looking kind of bored at a meeting, and then a picture of this guy, and then through the magic of Photoshop, I have this image. And so he told me, that's archaeology too. And we became very, very close. And Dr. George started to speak to me the same way that my Iraqi grandparents would speak to me. My grandparents left in the 1940s, and I'm very thankful that up until the age of 10, I was able to hear stories about Baghdad and how amazing it was, and how proud my grandparents were to be Arabs as Jews living in that city. And this is the kind of thing that I feel like I'm constantly pushing against in my work, that I'm trying to unsettle. You know, decolonization is sometimes talked about in terms of unsettling, which is to unsettle this image of what the Middle East has been historically. Because what they've succeeded in erasing, along with Palestine and along with everything, is that they've succeeded in erasing millennia of history in a very short period of time, if you think about it. And so this is something where, because it's such a short period of time that this theft has happened with it, I still have some kind of hope that we can reclaim these things. Not just reclaim them, but also reanimate them, so they're not just nostalgia. How can they be wielded in the future as a way of not necessarily reconstructing, but re-becoming? And so the image I want to stop with, this image is so precious to me. I live in Chicago, and the exhibition was happening in New York. And my gallery started to send me images. Dr. George was coming to the exhibition every day, and he was staying for hours. And and he was giving tours of the artifacts the same way that he was giving tours in his museum in Baghdad. And he started to actually rearrange the artifacts to sort of like say, no, it should be this way, historically it should be. And I spoke with him on the phone once, and he told me he was very emotional in front of those artifacts. He said the colors from all this Middle Eastern food wrapping and everything else, it's totally different than the stone that they're made out of. Like, you got the size right. And so when I see these objects hovering over me, he said, this is as close as I'm ever getting to them again. And it's important to recognize that this is not an American story, it's an Iraqi story, so it has a sad ending because Dr. George passed away in 2011, unable to return. So I guess that's all I've got to say right now. Sorry to end on such a bummer, but that's reality.
Thank you so much. You want to?
Okay, I mean, 7 minutes is all the time quite a very short time to present self and work. So I mean, it's like really challenging, but I would try my best. So I am Sandi Hilal, and I born in Palestine, lived there, and then went to Italy, come back to Palestine and established with my partner a studio of architecture called Decolonizing Architecture, Art and Residency, and actually when after living 13 years in Italy, and we decided we want to form a family together, and we both thought he's Italian and Palestinian, we both thought that Palestine is a much better place to sort of grow up our kids, especially in the first 10 to 12 years, because we want to escape modernism and colonization the way it is in Europe, and we would like them to born and be raised in Palestine. And actually, being there, we were absolutely confronted with what does it mean on practical level and on daily ways, and through architecture to understand decolonization. So we were straightforward actually dealing with decolonization in terms of architecture. And I mean, I'm really jumping now, because in many ways this is the only way for me to be able to speak about my project. So after 10 years of living in Palestine, never managed to get any family reunion. So my husband was all the time illegal, getting in and out from Israel each 3 months, not knowing if he can come back. And after 10 years of practice there, we thought it is time maybe to shift. And on the other hand, it was a moment where we felt finally the struggle of decolonization is back inside the house of the colonizer, so it's back to Europe in many ways, and we decided maybe our location now needs to be Europe if we want to understand decolonization differently. So we decided actually to come back, and Sweden was generous enough in all ways that I would not speak about. In many ways, we managed to found refuge here. And my husband got a position of a professorship, so I came with him. So I was this time the follower. No? So in Palestine, I was the one actually maybe having the family in a place where I born, so I felt a bit responsibility of being the one leading the family. And in Sweden, I definitely lived the moment of being a follower, and what does that mean for me after follower women. So it has a lot of very strange feelings where maybe for the first time I felt myself a wife, right? I mean, rather than any other moment. And it might really sound very strange in a very feminist place like Sweden. I was telling my friends, this is my first time that I feel myself a wife, no, in many ways. But matter of fact, I mean, I do not want to stop there because I want to speak with you about the project. So I arrived to Sweden, and I was lucky enough to be commissioned immediately by the Public Art Agency in Sweden to do a project in Boden. And we were, between leaving Palestine and coming to Sweden, we have a year of transition in the United States. And I came to visit Boden while we were in the United States. And in a sense, I all the time describe my visit to Boden because I was sent to work with refugees, right? So the whole thing is that you go there and you think about the project of working together with refugees, knowing that actually I spent 7 years working as head of a UN department in Palestine, at UNRWA, that deals with refugee camps. So in that sense, I was a good combination between decolonization and refugee homes. So if I want to position myself in between two areas, it's certainly refugees and decolonization, my main topics. And so basically I arrived to Buden with me thinking, what does it mean for me to be a follower and a guest in a place, right? So I was really troubled with this idea of being a guest. And in Buden, it felt like, I all the time says that I remember my first time of visiting this place as hugging my fear, as hugging, if there is a polar bear, as they describe it, it was me hugging my fear in a place where, I arrived to Buden and it was 25 degrees below zero, it was dark. People there they arrive and it needs them a while until they understand where they are, and it was super there. I felt a lot of depression in the place, and as refugees would arrive and think, but this is not the Sweden we were thinking about, right? They were completely shocked of what Sweden is after you do all this in order to arrive to Sweden, and then suddenly you find yourself in Buden, right? And I also mentioned that I worked in refugee camp for 7 years, so am I going? I worked in refugee camp for 7 years, and in many ways what stuck to you in a place like Palestinian refugee camp in all the Middle East is the political agency. Palestinian refugees never normalized their condition, and they still insisted on their political status and political subjectivity, right? And they all the time rejected normalization, rejected aid as only aid. They never accept their position as refugees, and they still actually hold on to this political subjectivity, right? So when I went to Buden, I was looking for this political subjectivity, and I was depressed. No, there was no way that, I didn't see any of these political subjectivity, and I thought, in here I cannot do any project. There is no way. And on top of this, everybody I would speak to in Buden would think that Malmo is the solution, right? So in that way, that they did not arrive to Buden is not Sweden, Malmo would be Sweden, and finally they would find what they are looking for. And I was a bit desperate in one of these, I visited a place called the Yellow House, which is one of the most discriminated refugee houses in Buden, sitting on one of the beds of one Iraqi refugee. And he was telling me, when my wife would arrive, I would take her to Malmo. I should absolutely go to the south. This is what Sweden is all about. And out of desperation, I told him, my God, all of you wants to go to Malmo or eventually to Stockholm. Nobody wants to stay here. And I said, what kind of project can I ever do here? And do you know anybody that wants to stay in Buden? I didn't expect an answer, but he says, yeah, you should meet Yasmin and Brahim. Wait a minute, who are Yasmin and Brahim? And I was really eager to meet them, because if this guy thought, if Yasmin and Brahim managed to understand why they should stay in Buden, maybe I would find a way to do my project, right? And I explained before, I was following my husband, so I really needed this commission. I was as desperate Yasmin and Brahim, right? So I get inside their house, and the first visit for me in Buden was together with two representatives of the Public Art Agency. And you should know that the Public Art Agency, in my mind, I was saying that I got commissioned by the Swedish government, because when they describe themselves, they say, we are a body of the government, do public art. And when they met me in Stockholm the first time, took me to Buden, I thought, wow, I'm accompanied by the Swedish government. We arrived to Buden, and then the media is there, because the artist that is accompanied by the Swedish government arrives to Buden, right? So they made it all to make me feel that there is something very important that is happening there. And imagine that with all this, when we would call Ibrahim desperately, he never answered his phone. But then, finally, 3 hours before our flight, he would answer. And as any Syrian refugees, they would tell you, of course, come in. And later on, Yasmin would tell me that Ibrahim called me and he says, the government are coming back. So I said, you can imagine what sort of mess was created out of this. So we arrived to, I'm finishing, I mean, I would arrive, imagine me, no, I would arrive to the house of Yasmin and Ibrahim with the Swedish government. And I told you that I was looking for this political subjectivity, right? So, I mean, I really had in mind something that I was unable to find elsewhere. And at the certain point, we arrived and I began to speak. We arrived and speaking in Arabic to Yasmin and Ibrahim, and I thought, oh my God, we are alienating the Swedish government. So to translate everything in English, and then they were offering them makluba, and they were saying, but what should we put the yogurt on the rice? And I was like, yeah. And I was all the time sort of trying to make sure that we are not alienating the Swedish government in the living room of Yasmin and Ibrahim. And in that sense, I found the political subjectivity I was looking for the moment that I saw the bride through which Yasmin and Ibrahim were hosting. And at this point, the project departure, if you want to know more, you can know more, but the project departure with this question, who has the right to host? And who should be guest forever in a place, right? And from there, a whole long project began in many other places in the world. I can tell you more, but to finish with, I am an architect, so I'm not only interested in hosting as a sort of only conceptual framework, but I see this happening in many places. And for me, the dimension of the living room as a space between the private and the public, where people can still be master of their own life and still be hosting in their own terms. And the living room is the only space in the house that can be turned into public. And the moment that you have no means to belong to the public, many people turn their living rooms into their own collectivities. The problem is that many of these living rooms still closed. And my question is that, is there a possibility to understand our cities today by having a lot more than a public space, or there is only one master public space that we should all obey to? So this is the project I'm involved in since 2 years, and I'm happy to be here.
Just kidding. Joanna Lombard is my name. Yes, I'm an artist, and I'm born in Algeria, 72, and then with a French mother and a Swedish father. They met coincidentally on an island outside of Spain. And my mother went back to Algeria, and suddenly my grandfathers understood that 3 of their 4 daughters were pregnant at the same time. It was a big scandal. No father they couldn't see any fathers. So they tried to find my father in Sweden. It's a long story, but finally they find him, and my father, me, and my mother hitchhiked to Sweden through Europe. They stopped on many places, but finally they came to Sweden, and my mother and father was not a couple, they just had me together, and it was the 70s in Sweden, and many communes were, appears in in Sweden, and my parents thought that that was a good place to grow up in. So my mother and my father disappeared, but my mother and me, we were hitchhiking around in Sweden while I was 3 or 4 years old, between all the communes, like in Småland, in north of Sweden and around, and stayed there for a while and then continued. And finally we find a commune in north of Sweden called Ljusbacken. It's you don't see so much of it. But maybe you can see a little bit. This commune was in Hälsingland, one of the, I should describe it like one of the biggest commune in Sweden during the 70s. We were one of the first living there. It was between 73 and 84 around. And in my art practice, I've been interested in looking at ideologies, ideas, and for example, how do you say, they were practicing lots of different things like therapy, meditation for weeks, and all this trying to be, they were like, the main thing were like to go together and try to make a smaller society in the bigger society and be better humans. And I've been like looking at that in my art practice in different ways. I've been doing lots of interviews with the people. That was young by then. I was a child. I was and that one. But this has been a source of inspiration for telling lots of different stories, films, photo series, or different kind of works. And one of the one thing that has been interesting for me is to look at groups, how group dynamics, because in a commune like this, it's often a situation that you have to decide in big meetings, like stormöte, if you haven't heard about it. Stormöten, it's like big meetings, everybody has to come, and now we have to talk about this issue, and we have to decide something. And I felt that my mother from Algeria and France and didn't speak so good Swedish always were excluded from different situations. And as a child, to see that, it's always, I think it's quite complicated, because in one way you are dependent on your mother or your parents, of course, and you want to be on their sides. On another side, you want to be like with a group. So I've always felt like divided at that. And I wanted to do a work about that. Actually, it was connected to a special event, but I felt often that the whole world or the commune laughed to my mother. And especially in very funny things, like I could laugh me too, because it was so many misunderstanding with her language, because she said things that were misunderstood all the time. So people laughed to her. And I decided to do a work around that, and I will show you this image, and I will oops, something. sorry. Technique. There. No, that's this there. So why is no?
there's this, yeah.
Yeah. There.
It's coming from here.
It's not. But
To my
what am I? Oh, it may be very loud. Yeah, it's not too loud. I start from the beginning. This is a 10 minutes 8-channel installation, but
Okay.
no. This was installed in outside here in Moss in Norway, and each voice was in one tree. And it was burnt grass in a circle, and so it was very dramatic and beautiful at the same time. And you were experiencing this laughing towards you from everywhere. Yeah, it was just one example of my works.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have like 15 minutes to talk and then we have to leave. So it's the rules. So I told you, Sandi, when we were going to sit here, like, let's this be like a living room, this chat here, because it feels pretty much like it here in this space. And one thing I've been thinking about throughout the day is like empty spaces, the things that are not there, the void that you had to fill in Boden with the right to host, all the empty spaces in the exhibition space, even the empty spaces where the connection with Bedros Bushani was not working, like all this information that is there and how we in a way have to fill up. And I personally think that that's the role of art, to fill those empty spaces with laughter, even though I don't know if they're laughing at her or with her.
That's that's was my question when I was doing it. Is it possible to put the viewer or the listener in this case in this situation? Am I in the group or outside the group? Mm-hmm. So that's what I want you to be unsure about.
Exactly, and like, are you in or out? And being a host, being a guest all the time. If you take the microphone, Michael, I have a question. And it's, I don't know if you were here on Friday when the exhibition opened, but it was a feeling I have never had in any art venue in Sweden. Like the vibes, like this, it was so vibrant, it was so beautiful. And I want to ask you, how did the Iraqi community of Malmö get engaged in the project?
Well, this is actually, a real example of the way that art institutions can be. And I think that I can't really tell the story, the intricacies of how the relationship was built, but it's a story for the people at the Malmö Konsthall to tell, and it's been such an incredible honor to work with Mats Stjernstedt and Angela Cesarek and also Anna Kindval, who I think really kind of led the way with recognizing the fact that I wanted this to be a site-specific exhibition from Malmö, and knowing what I knew about this city, and knowing that the exhibition was a place that I didn't simply want to be a kind of inert and aloof space. I wanted it to be activated. One of the main things we rebuilt or reappeared is this banquet hall from ancient Nimrud in the north of Iraq that was not only demolished in 2015 by Daesh, but before that was completely ravaged by the Western archaeologists and their desire for cultural patrimony, for merchandise. And so it just, I think as we started thinking about this, we thought about what it would mean for a banquet hall to be a banquet hall. And what would it mean for it to actually be, and actually I said this on Friday night at the opening, I said, let this be a living room. And it means a living room, like what does it mean for a room to actually live and breathe as well? And so Malmö Kunsthall reached out to the Iraqi Cultural Association, and we have its director here in the room, the amazing Lina Al-Nahar, who has basically become like a sister to me in a very short period of time, and just brought the entire community into the space, and they made it their own. And I've never experienced anything like this. Sometimes, you talk about public art. I was trained in public art, and this was the most public art in a museum, right, that I've ever experienced, because it really was a kind of, it wasn't just a claiming of space, it was hosting. And this idea of what it means to host, so the Iraqi Cultural Association was listed as hosts, and this idea of who hosts is such an incredible question to be asking on every level, architecturally, but also socially. Because the term host, comes from the root of host and hospitality. It's from auspice and ostis, which means guest, but it also means stranger, and it also means enemy. So this is why you have the same root for hospitality and hostility. And so it opens up all these possibilities. And I think that one of the things that I've always appreciated is the way in which so much of that cultural heritage that I grew up with was about hosting and what it means to host. But you've made me think about it in this way where it really is also about a certain kind of power, like a holding of place. And when you mix that with what you were talking about, the subjectivity and resisting the normalization, and also engaging in sumud, or steadfastness, that's an incredible mix of things all at the same time, of the sweet and the sour simultaneously.
Yes.
I guess I was also, very much, after I began this project, one hadith in Islam was for me a very important sort of almost guidelines that says you can be a guest for 3 days, then after that you become a sadaqah, become an object of pettiness, right? I have a pettiness towards you, and therefore, I assist you, but you would lose, after 3 days, you would lose the honor of being a guest, because a guest, being host and guest comes with a lot of honor in social codes, right? And it's very clear is that after the 3rd day, you would lose the honor of being a guest. Then what happens, right? And I only would like to draw your attention to 2 things. Either if you are, for me, you can be full human only the moment that you alternate being a guest and the host. If you would think yourself only as a host, you are a colonial, because I still remember my grandmother, a Palestinian grandmother saying that when British arrived to Palestine, they treated them, and she says stupidly, she filled the one that is stupid into treating them as guests. And they behave as masters, right? They behave as hosts. They did not accept their guest as a guest, right? So if you are only host and you think yourself as host, you have a very harsh colonial mind that needs to be rethought, right? So in that sense, all this unconditional hospitality needs to be rethought completely, because it's not unconditional hospitality, it's accepting to be a guest and a host. If you don't accept it, sorry for you guys, but you have a sort of, you should revise your colonial mind. If you accept yourself as a guest, you accept to be an object of pettiness after 3 days. So what we do, right? Should we raise the question, who has the right to host? Also in a place like Sweden, in Europe, who has the right to host and who should behave? The whole rhetoric, you come to our house, you behave. What does that mean? That means that you should be guest forever. In the contract that you do with the government is to accept to be an eternal guest. Means that you are subject to certain, you lose your political subjectivity in that sense. So for me, when I arrived to Sweden, and I will finish with this, I lived in Italy for 13 years. And I behaved as a perfect guest in all senses. I love Italy. I miss Italy more than my husband. I great Italian food. I speak academic Italian because I did my PhD in Italian. I ticked all the boxes. If there are boxes to tick in order for me to be a 100% person that exercises integration, I am this example. Yet, and I even married an Italian, right? And I never became Italian. And when I arrived to Sweden, I say, no more. I would not get into this road of thinking that I would become Swede after 15 years. I would not become a Swede after 15 years. So what is my options, right? And it's from there that this project comes strong, is that I don't want to be only a guest in a place. I want to participate after 3 days. In my being here, I want to be a political subject. What we do? This is a major question for migration and a huge one for colonization. So in that sense, to only think who is the host, who is the eternal host, and who is the eternal guest, lead us to certain layers in society that, sooner or later we need to deal with.
We were cut short in the previous portion of the questions when this issue about colonization came up, which is the issue, is the question. I think we're getting some hints here of what decolonization could look like with the takeover of the Konstal and the hosting and, the exclusions in art. Could art be the answer?
I think art can be a part of yes, of course it can be the solution, but it can contribute to the discussion. And I'm just thinking about a discussion I had the other day about art. Is it about life and death? Someone said that, and we were like, no, it's not about life and death. Of course, it can be very serious, but it's not on life and death. That thought, because I just think about it. I'm very integrated to the Swedish society, so I don't have the same outside view as you have something. But in my art, I'm like looking from my mother's perspective on to be always feeling a little bit excluded and always being like questioned. Is that really the right way to behave? Or yeah. Sorry, I couldn't answer this really.
No, but it is the exclusions, and I think it opens up for the conversation in a different way, which is what's happening here today. Art, I mean.
Yeah, I think that in my case, art was a good way to break social codes without being the not grateful guest, I should put it. Otherwise, if the social norms are this, that you should behave, I should behave, and you are my host, and then when I arrive, then I refuse to behave, and I say I want to practice my own hosting, right, and I want to demand my right to host. In that sense, art is super useful because I'm not breaking social codes rather than actually refuging in the fiction of art to say I want to demand something. And this is again the same with all people with whom I am working in the project, because the project is taking a lot of places, and we open a public madafa in Boden. And if you would speak with Yasmin and Brahim, they immediately say we are not doing an integration project, we are doing an art project, because who we are as refugees to think that we are the integrators rather than being integrated by Swedes. And being a vulnerable refugee, you don't break these social codes very easily, and in that sense I all the time feel art has this power of sort of moving between fiction and reality, where at the end of the day, once Yasmin laughing, she says, if things would go wrong, I would say this is the crazy artist, right? So it's not me breaking codes in Sweden, that the crazy artist is doing. So so sometimes when it comes to seriously questioning certain social codes that maybe we are not entitled to question, I feel art is a good protector in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that art does give a platform that is not always available elsewhere, and I think that thinking about it as some kind of a shield, or some kind of an opportunity to disengage from social codes is an interesting place to enact things. It is a place where vision can happen, and it's also a place where absurdity can happen. And being able to kind of wield it and mobilize it is something that can actually, hopefully, have an impact that changes the status quo. But I also think that those spaces don't necessarily need to just be relegated to art. If there's a dispersal of those kinds of platforms being enacted without it being funded by a public art agency, and without it being something that necessarily even has to come through an artist, I think that kind of engagement with subterfuge or circumvention, or being able to be socially mischievous, can happen from anyone. These are a kind of impulse that people, I think, feel in general, of trying to find ways to establish loopholes in systems. And I just think that there's sometimes a danger in it only happening through art, because it can also be seen as the only place that it gets enacted, and then it becomes also a bit of an excuse for it to not be enacted as a kind of a social reality. So I think that we have to be careful about these things being as easy as apology. That it's a little bit like for the person that's doing it as opposed to the people that you're...
Crazy artist.
Well, not the crazy artist. No, not for the crazy artist. For the public art agency that's working with the crazy artist. Not that you're a crazy artist, but it's just that's the thing that I feel needs to be needs to be watched.
Can I react once? Because, for example, in my case, I came from being an architect that has worked on the ground constantly, and my sort of, as an architect, you envision something, and normally what you will be building between your vision and the ground is, if your vision is 100%, negotiating on the ground, you arrive to build maximum 20. This is like a great success. So we are used all the time to be actually challenged by the ground, negotiated by the, and suddenly sometimes if you would look in the last 20 years, a lot of architects refuge in the artwork as a way to think, wow, this space, you can build 100% of your vision without being stopped, right? So in that sense, since 20 years to this part, there are a lot of architects that are more and more claiming themselves as an artist as a way to fully actually, not escape the ground, but be between both and still be testing your ideas in the art. So for me, if it doesn't move between both, between the ground and the art, there is something wrong again. I mean, of course, then we enter into the fiction as so in that sense, it's very important to understand how to feed then these ideas on the ground and the other way around, and if not, we are again in the same loop.
And I'm an artist that found refuge in architecture, and this is one of those interesting moments where we start to realize that part of the unsettling process is getting rid of these categorizations. That this is also a relatively new thing. Specialization is a relatively new thing in human history. And that, one of the great things about antiquity is they didn't differentiate between art and architecture. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm interested in, again, is the hope that the word artist might disappear in 100 years, because it is something that is embedded in all these different in everybody's life, and I do think that, one of the reasons why I decided to never be an architect was because I didn't want the responsibility of being an architect, like to make things that don't fall down, and I'm also terrible with math. And so there were certain things where I went to an art program in a department of architecture so I could get away with it. But we've seen work here that is moving beyond, the scope of what it is that we were necessarily trained to do. And I've always wondered what that was. And Tony Fry, who is a sustainable architect from Australia, told me that what I'm doing is called redirective practice. And what you're doing, according to him, would be redirective practice. And that is where, when you're working outside of what is considered your training, and you're taking on the training of other fields, you do it in an unorthodox way. And that can lead to a kind of directional and also ethical change within those fields, that you're willing to make a huge mistake that shows the bigger mistakes that are in the field. And so I think that, one of the things that was in the room that was really beautiful was laughter. And you talked about empty spaces. And one of the things that happens in the kind of contagion of laughter, I mean, if we were watching that for the full 10 minutes, I think we all would have started laughing. I think it started to happen. So this idea that there can be a kind of rupture even of what language is, and also what, the social norm of a space is something that happens in groups. And I feel like what we're all doing is also engaging groups that end up, sculpting what it is that we're doing, because it's those stories that you're telling about Yasmin and Ibrahim that are really kind of like bringing, a kind of form to what's being suggested here. A question that I had when you were speaking was when you were saying that you want to be his political subject and not an object of pittiness. What does that mean, being a political subject?
Well, I would say that, first of all, not to behave. To begin with, not to behave and to actually come straight forward with my political ideas in a place where they think that I should only be grateful and obey. So and that's a still exercise political life, no matter what does that mean. I mean, either in my own way of, and in a sense, as an architect, I would also tell you, belong to the public space in my own terms, because what I am questioned to do is to belong to the public space in others' people's terms, and therefore I would not be able to participate fully to my potential capacities, right? So for me, it's very important to understand how I would still, to be grateful to a place where you will be participating to your fully potentials, and I am not. You know, the way that they propose the contract, I would not be participated to my fully. So I don't want to be in a place and actually live in a place without being a person that can participate politically, socially, engaged on everyday life, rethinking the public space. I mean, as an artist, Sweden thinks that they have the best public space that they manage to, which is, I mean, in terms of architecture and forms, it's true, but it is one of these places that is highly codified. You know, I all the time say, I have a PhD, and still, you know, moving around me when I move in the public space, because maybe I think I'm not behaving properly. And this comes from where? I mean, this comes from the fact that, you know, in a sense, you are also sometimes directed on how, and when people arrive here and they take Swedish courses, they are taught how to behave, right? I mean, we are in a place where you are taught how to behave when you are 40 years old, sometimes 50, sometimes you are a mother of 10 people, yet you are taught how to be a mother. I mean, this is unacceptable in many ways, and for me, being political subjects means to be seen as a political subject, not at this age. I mean, I'm 46 years old and to be taught how to behave. I mean, for me, political subjectivity needs to be...
I hate to tell you that we have to finish. But I don't know, like, if we have like 5 minutes or so, just for questions or comments from the audience. Well, you can continue talking, like.
Thank you.
Anything anyone here would like to share with the rest of us?
Oh, you stay in love. I stay. Tomorrow I'm leaving. I have 2 daughters.
Yeah. You have to be.
I've already stayed past 3 days. And I'm staying 3 more, so.
She'll leave tomorrow.
Thank you so much for starting this out. It's